46.1%. 46.1% of youth in America voted in the last general election, according to a statistic titled Youth Voter Turnout in Presidential Elections from 1972 to 2016. This was published in March of 2019 by Statista. To be clear, this is the highest the statistic has been since 2008, when it was 51.1%. However, this is still not good enough for our youth voter turnout. As someone who is going to have the opportunity to vote in their first presidential election this November, I'm here to tell you about my proposal. Voting should be mandatory for all in America. Voter turnout has long been a struggle in the United States, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. I've been looking into the prospect of mandatory voting since my AP Gov teacher brought it up last year as a way to solve these turnout issues. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the benefits that mandatory voting would create for our nation. An increase in voter turnout. Instead of focusing on getting the vote out, we can focus on the issues that really matter, and how this would help the underrepresented minorities get their voices heard. Now I'm going to go into more detail about how this increases voter turnout. In any given year, voter turnout is not changing. Mandatory voting would increase this number by an exponential amount. Voter turnout has stayed around 60% or below since 1912, and 40 to 50% since 1912 for midterms. And this number should be going up exponentially due to the increase in the amount of eligible or registered voters we have each year. According to this statistic here, it states that since 1996, when we had 127 million registered voters, to now, where we have 153 million voters, we should have a drastic increase in our voter turnout. So the question remains to be seen. Why? Why is it not changing if we have so many more people who can have their voices heard? Voting to some can be considered a right, so it's not something you necessarily have to do if you don't want to. However, many people consider that it should be a civic responsibility. A civic responsibility just like paying your taxes and going to jury duty. This means that not only is voting a right, it is a duty we have. We also have to take advantage of this because there are a ton of other countries that have never or will never allow their citizens to vote, or have never or will never allow the women to vote in the country. So if we have these opportunities, why are we not taking advantage of them is the question that remains to be seen. There are numerous other countries that have implemented this mandatory voting system. A few examples, the most successful examples would be Australia, Brazil, and even Belgium, who when it was created, that's how their system was. It's always been a mandatory voting system. According to Mandatory Voting, the Pros and Cons, written by Griffith Traversy in 2002 and published by JSTOR, voter turnout went from around 59% in 1922 to 91% in 1925 in Australia. This was just one single election cycle. And since the installation of this compulsory voting program, the voter turnout has never gone below 90%. This seems like an incredible feat, especially for us, where it's never gone above a 60%. Now, I want to go into a little bit more detail about how we can focus a little bit less on getting the vote out and instead focus more on platforms the politicians have. For those of you that don't know, getting the vote out is described as efforts aimed at increasing the voter turnout in elections. This is something that politicians really focus on getting across, because what is the point of running for president if you have no one to vote for you? Numerous politicians are in support of mandatory voting and how it would make the democracy a much better place than it already is. In an article titled Mandatory Voting as Pre-Commitment and Nudge, written by Kevin Elliott in April 2017 and published by the Journal of Politics, he states that there are numerous politicians, including former President Obama, that would be in heavy support of mandatory voting, calling it an ideal democracy, which I'll get into a little bit more later. So, if it means that politicians are in support of this proposal, it has to be for a certain reason. This means they can focus more on their platforms being what they think socially as well as fiscally. Are they pro-LGBTQ plus rights, pro-choice, pro-life, or do they believe in the drop-down, economic policy? It's all the important things that matter when you do decide to vote. It also means that if people never have any intention to vote in the first place, that they will not bother to learn about these different policies that politicians have. And these different policies might help their future. If you're in the lower class, a different set of economics might help you. You don't know. And so people aren't taking full advantage of how they can better their futures. So that's the main thing I wanted to get across for that section. So now on to how mandatory voting will help underrepresented minorities get their voices heard. The majority of those who do not vote, not turn out to vote, tend to be the minorities. In a statistic published on Statista titled Voter Turnout Among Select Ethnicities in the U.S. Presidential Elections from 1964 to 2016, published by Aaron O'Neill in February 2020, as you can see there, it states that Asian and Hispanic voter turnout is always at least below 40% and always at least 20% below the national average, which is in blue. So what does this really mean? People aren't getting their voices heard. Minorities aren't getting their voices heard. As you can see, the white is the black line, so that's always getting their voices heard. Black is the gray line, and they're almost always getting their voices heard. But then on the bottom, all by itself, you have Hispanic and Asian at a very, very low rate. So we don't know what they think, and we don't know what can help them. It's not an ideal democracy. This is what I wanted to talk about, and I said I'd mention it before. Ideal democracy means that we get almost all voices heard, or as many voices as possible heard, because then we actually have a true view of what everyone thinks. There are certain people who think that mandatory voting would give an advantage to certain parties, which tends to be the more democratic parties, because most people who don't turn out to vote tend to be on the more liberal-leaning side. In an article from the newspaper The New York Times where they argued about mandatory voting, titled Is Mandatory Voting a Good Idea?, in November of 2011, the same person who brought up how this might give certain advantages to the Democratic Party also brought up that it's very important that underrepresented minorities, which can include also people who are poorer in the lower class, or people who are Hispanic or Asian, said that this would really give them a chance to have their voices heard if they've never had it heard before. And this could increase political efficacy, which basically just means how much trust people have in their government and if they think their government actually is doing a good job. So now I kind of just want to summarize everything that we just talked about. I personally think voting should be mandatory because if it is, voter turnout will be greatly increased. What's the point of voting if no one's going to show up to vote? Also, getting the vote out won't be as important, and underrepresented minorities will finally get their voices heard if they haven't been heard before. Now, I know that everyone in here is at least 18 years old, which means that you do have the opportunity to vote. So I urge you to go out and vote this year. Also, if you do feel that mandatory voting will be helpful for our democracy, you can write our California Senators Kamala Harris or Dianne Feinstein. Thank you.
Steve?